Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something that affects every single one of us, the biochemistry of aging.
That's right. And we're not just talking about, getting older. We're looking at the actual molecular level.
Exactly. The molecular failures, the genetic programs that are running in the background, dictating how and why our bodies decline over time.
And the sources for this dive really frame it in a specific way. It's not just a slow, random decline. It's a mix of things.
A mix of what, exactly?
It's a combination of stochastic damage, so random wear and tear, and these very specific genetically programmed clocks. Both are happening at once.
And understanding that mechanism is, well, it's more than just an academic exercise, isn't it? It's hugely important for human health.
Oh, absolutely. We see these processes go into overdrive in certain diseases. Things like Hutchinson-Gilford, Werner syndrome.
Right, and Down syndrome, too. They all show this kind of dramatically accelerated aging.
They do. And on the flip side, if we can figure out those molecular triggers for, say, cell death,
We could use them.
we could co-opt them. Imagine being able to tell a tumor cell to just turn on its own self-destruct sequence. That's a massive goal in clinical research.
So our mission for you, the learner, is to break this all down step by step. We want to give you the biochemical nuts and bolts.
The mechanisms, the pathways, the why, and the so what behind all of it.
Okay, so where do we start?
We have to start with a really critical clarification. The difference between life expectancy and longevity. They sound the same, but they are not.
Right. Life expectancy is the average for all births, and that number gets dragged way down by infant mortality.
Exactly. The example used is fantastic. A child born in ancient Rome might have had a life expectancy of, 25 years?
But that's not the whole story.
Not at all. If you survive childhood, your longevity, your expected lifespan, nearly doubled. It went up to almost 48.
And we still see that pattern, even today.
We do. In the U.S., a 5-year-old in 1950 had a longevity of about 70.5 years. 50 years later, in 2000, that only went up to about 77.5.
So even with all our modern medicine, we're hitting some kind of a biological ceiling.
A very stubborn one, which leads to the central debate here.
Is that ceiling caused by random stochastic damage, just wear and tear, or is it a genetically programmed clock, something like puberty?
And the consensus is, well, it's both. It's multifactorial. Both things are contributing. So let's start with the damage, the stuff we just can't escape.
And it's so ironic that the things that are essential for life on Earth, water, oxygen, sunlight, are also the main chemical culprits here.
It really is. Let's start with water. Hydrolytic damage.
Water is everywhere in the cell, over 55 molar concentration.
Right. And even though it's a weak nucleophile, just by sheer numbers, it's going to attack things. It's a numbers game.
So where does that damage hit the hardest?
In proteins, it's the amide bonds on the side chains of asparagine and glutamine. Water turns those neutral groups into acidic ones.
So asparagine becomes aspartate.
And glutamine becomes glutamate. And that simple change in charge can completely wreck a protein's shape, its function, everything.
Yeah.
It could just render it useless.
And what about our DNA, our genetic blueprint?
That's where it gets even more dangerous. Water can attack the amino groups on our nucleotide bases, cytosine, adenine, guanine,
And change them into something else entirely.
into uracil, hypoxanthine, and xanthine, which are, they're potent mutagens if the cell doesn't fix them.
Yeah.
Or, even worse, water can just snip the base right off the sugar backbone.
Creating the basic site, a blank spot.
Exactly. And that's the core difference, right? If a protein gets damaged, okay, the cell can usually just break it down and make a new one.
Protein turnover.
But DNA damage, that's a permanent record. That's a mutation the cell has to carry forward. It's much, much more significant.
Okay, so that sets us up for maybe the most famous wear and tear idea, oxidative stress.
Right. If water is a slow, constant threat, oxygen is where you get the spectacular, rapid damage from reactive oxygen species, or ROS.
And we make these things just living, breathing.
We do. But the dominant manufacturing plant for these ROS is the mitochondrion, specifically the electron transport chain.
The power plant of the cell.
It is, and because it has this incredibly high flow of electrons, it's inherently leaky. And that leakage creates things like superoxide and hydrogen peroxide.
And once those ROS leak out, why are they so destructive?
They are just chemically voracious. They form what are called adducts. They basically just combine violently with almost any organic molecule they touch.
It's like the fats in our cell membranes.
Especially polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're really vulnerable. The source uses the analogy of rancid butter.
That smell. That's the fatty acids breaking down.
That's peroxidation. And in a cell, that leads to cross-linked lipids, making the membrane stiff and brittle. You lose fluidity, and that messes up everything from nerve signaling to nutrient transport.
And for DNA.
It's just as bad. You get adducts like adeoxyguanine, which can cause base pairing errors during replication, mutations.
And the real danger here is that it becomes a chain reaction.
It does. One free radical makes another free radical, which makes another, and it just keeps going until an antioxidant finally neutralizes it.
So in this whole destructive family of ROS, which one is the worst?
Yep.
The apex predator.
That would be the hydroxyl radical,
Yeah.
OH dot. It is unbelievably reactive.
And how do we make that from the less reactive stuff?
There are two main, pretty terrifying pathways. The first is the Fenton reaction.
The Fenton reaction.
This is where iron, specifically ferrous iron, F2+, acts as a catalyst. It takes hydrogen peroxide and converts it into the hydroxyl radical. And since the iron can be recycled, the process just keeps going.
So iron becomes this little rogue factory for making the most dangerous radical.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The second path is the Haber-Weiss reaction. That's where superoxide and hydrogen peroxide react together to directly produce the hydroxyl radical.
Okay, so this all brings us back to the mitochondrion, which is making all these ROS in the first place. This is the mitochondrial theory of aging.
Right. The core idea is this self-perpetuating damage cycle.
Right.
The ETC makes ROS. The ROS then damage the components of the ETC itself.
Which causes the ETC to get leakier.
And produce even more ROS. It's a vicious cycle that just accelerates over time.
But why are the mitochondria so vulnerable? Why can't they just repair the damage like the rest of the cell?
It all comes down to their genome. Mitochondrial DNA is this small, circular, vestigial thing, a remnant from when they were bacteria.
And it's missing something crucial.
It's missing the robust repair enzymes that our nuclear DNA has. So when damage happens to the mitochondrial genome, it tends to stick around. It becomes a permanent flaw.
And when that mitochondrial dysfunction hits a certain point, the cell has a decision to make.
It does. It might decide it's better to just self-destruct rather than risk becoming cancerous or just ineffective. And that process is apoptosis, programmed cell death.
So how does the mitochondria actually pull that trigger?
When damage signals get high enough from ROS, or DNA damage, it triggers the opening of a specific channel. It's called a permeability transition pore complex.
A gateway opens up in the mitochondrial membrane.
A highly regulated one, yes. And through that gateway escapes a small protein called cytochrome C.
Which is normally part of the electron transport chain.
Exactly. But once it's free in the cytoplasm, it has a totally new job. It acts as the core, the scaffold, for building a machine called the apoptosis.
And the apoptosis is the executioner.
It's what starts the execution. It activates a family of enzymes called caspases. And the terminal caspase 3 and 7, they go out and systematically dismantle the cell for disposal.
It's just amazing that this internal kill switch is the very thing researchers are trying to flip in cancer cells.
Absolutely. If we can control that pore, we can potentially target all kinds of malicious cells.
Okay, let's step away from oxygen and water. What about other environmental damage, UV radiation?
Right. Sunlight. UV light is high energy, and it's strongly absorbed by the aromatic rings in our DNA bases.
And that energy causes...
Well, it can rupture bonds, generate more free radicals, but the most famous lesion is the thymine dimer. Two adjacent thymine bases in the DNA strand get covalently bonded together.
Which is highly mutagenic.
Extremely. It creates a big kink in the DNA that can lead to skin cancers if it's not repaired.
Okay, another major source of damage, and this one is tied to diet and metabolism, is protein glycation.
Yes. This is what happens when proteins are exposed to reducing sugars, mainly glucose.
How does that work, step by step?
It starts when an amine group on a protein reacts with glucose. It forms something called a Schiff base that rearranges into a more stable amidori product.
And that's not the end of it.
No. The real problem is that these amidori products can then react with other proteins, creating permanent, irreversible, covalent crosslinks between them.
And those crosslinks are the Advanced Glycation End products, the AGs.
Right. And they cause huge problems, especially in long-lived proteins that don't get replaced often, like collagen in your blood vessels or the crystallins in the lens of your eye.
So what do they do?
In blood vessels, they cause a loss of elasticity, making the heart work harder. In the eye, they reduce the transparency of the lens. That is literally what a cataract is.
And that's why doctors measure things like glycated hemoglobin in diabetics.
Exactly. It's a direct marker of how much of this damage is accumulating over time.
So with all this inevitable damage happening, our longevity must really depend on our defense and repair systems.
It absolutely does. Against ROS, you have enzymes like superoxide dismutase, and then you have chemical protectants like glutathione, vitamin C, vitamin E.
But the real star of the show has to be our DNA repair systems.
Without a doubt, the nuclear genome is protected by so many layers. Proofreading, mismatch repair, nucleotide excision repair for things like those thymine dimers. The list goes on.
But even with all that, some damage gets through.
It does, and that's the core of the somatic mutation theory of aging. That eventually, the accumulation of those few unrepaired mutations is what drives the decline in function.
And it's interesting how limited protein repair is in comparison. For the most part, we just throw damaged proteins out.
That's the main strategy. But there are a few very specific repairs we can do. We can fix oxidized cysteine and methionine, but only up to a certain point.
And what about that really specific one, the isoaspartyl group repair? That seems so precise.
It is. It's a fascinating bit of molecular mechanics. Sometimes the side chain of an aspartic acid residue will accidentally get inserted into the main peptide backbone, creating a kink.
So it breaks the chain and relinks it incorrectly.
Exactly. And this enzyme, isoaspartyl methyltransferase, comes in, methylates that incorrect bond, which makes it unstable.
And allows it to snap back into the correct configuration.
It's an amazing little rescue operation. But for the most part, proteins aren't repaired, and some, like aggregated amyloid proteins in Alzheimer's, are just totally resistant to removal.
Okay, let's make a big shift here. We've talked about all this random damage. Let's talk about the deterministic clocks, the idea that aging is programmed.
Right, and the most unambiguous example of programmed aging is female menopause. But the broader idea is the metabolic theory of aging.
The live fast, die young idea.
Basically, yeah, the brighter the candle, the quicker it burns. It's based on these striking observations that across all vertebrates, the total number of heartbeats in a lifetime is roughly constant.
Around 1 billion beats.
And the total amount of energy expended per gram of body mass is also strangely consistent. So the thought is, maybe the clock isn't counting time, it's counting.
Well, it's counting ROS production. It connects the random damage right back to a programmed metabolic rate.
But the most famous clock is the one that happens in our cells every time they divide, the telomere countdown clock.
Right. Our chromosomes are linear, and they're capped with these protective ends called telomeres, just long, repetitive sequences.
And the problems with how we copy DNA.
Exactly. DNA polymerase is unidirectional. Because of how it works, it always leaves the new strand a little bit short at one end.
So the telomeres are just there to be sacrificed to absorb that shortening with each division. Precisely. And after about 100 divisions in a typical human cell, those telomeres are used up. The cell then enters replicative senescence. It stops dividing. That's a hard limit.
Unless you have telomerase.
Right. Telomerase is the enzyme that rebuilds the telomeres. And it's active in stem cells, allowing them to keep dividing, but it's also famously reactivated in most cancer cells.
Now, this idea of programmed aging got a huge boost from work in model organisms. The discovery in the C. elegans worm was a complete game changer.
It really was. They found that mutating a single gene, the DAF2 gene, which is like our insulin receptor, extended the worm's lifespan by 70%.
A staggering amount.
And it wasn't just that they lived longer, they stayed physiologically younger for longer.
Which suggests aging isn't just something that happens to us, it's a program that can be tweaked.
It means the cell is making a choice. Normally, the DAF2 pathway tells the cell focus on growth and reproduction.
Right.
But when you mute that signal, other transcription factors like DAF16 and PHA4 take over.
And they tell the cell to do what?
To shift its priorities. Forget growth, focus on maintenance and repair. The cell hunkers down, becomes more stress-resistant, and its longevity just skyrockets.
So bringing this all together, what's the big picture?
The big picture is that aging is this complex interplay. You have the constant random damage piling up from ROS, from hydrolysis, from glycation. And at the same time, you have these hardwired deterministic clocks, like our metabolic rate and our telomeres, ticking down.
Which leaves us with the final, really provocative question that the material raises. Why would evolution select for a limited lifespan at all?
You'd think living forever would be the ultimate fitness advantage.
Right.
But evolution selects for the fitness of the species, not necessarily the individual. And from that perspective, a programmed limit on lifespan actually makes sense. It optimizes resource allocation for the group.
So once you're past your reproductive and nurturing years, your continued existence is a drain on resources for the next generation.
It could be, yes. So A genetically programmed limit enforces a kind of generational turnover. It supports that classic three-generation structure. The newborns, the reproducers and nurturers, and then the elders who provide knowledge and assistance. It's a trade-off for the good of the species.
An incredible thought that our own molecular clocks might be set for the survival of the population as a whole.
It really puts all the biochemistry into a much larger context.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the molecular origins of aging, and we encourage you to think about it for yourself. Is it the random damage or the deterministic clock that you think is the strongest predictor of how long we live?